Hello, and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project, and thank you so much for tuning in. I have an amazing guest with me today, and she has a very powerful story to share. Her name is Susan Omilian. She is an attorney, an author, and a motivational speaker who has worked to end violence against women for the past 40 years. Her work became more personal when her 19-year-old niece, Maggie, was killed by her ex-boyfriend in 1999. She dedicated herself to helping victims move on and thrive after abuse as Maggie could not. She is the originator and facilitator of My Avenging Angel Workshops, based on the belief that living well is the best revenge. And I think we can all agree about that. Her books include a trilogy of self-help workbooks in the Thrive Zone book series and novels in the Best Revenge book series, inspired by the true event of Maggie's story. Wow, Susan, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
And this is where I always say to some of my special guests who have this kind of a story, I wish I didn't have to talk to you. I wish I never met you or you never had this experience, but you did. So I would like for you to share with us what got you into this type of work at the very beginning. What, led you to work and help women, with abuse before it became so personal for you?
So thank you so much. And yeah, this is a story I talk about being in a club I never wanted to join. But if you are, then what can you do to make something good happen from it? So I've been doing this work for about 40 years, as you mentioned. It's hard to imagine that, but it's true. And I started out mostly because I was interested and fascinated by the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s. I was in college in the early 1970s, and that was the sort of beginning of what they now call the second wave of feminism. And I began to understand that was something I always wanted to be a lawyer. And one of the things that I realized as a fairly young girl, I grew up in Michigan in the Midwest, that girls weren't supposed to be lawyers. And I didn't know any women lawyers, and there weren't a lot of women lawyers around, but I wanted to do that. And so part of it became my own sort of little crusade to see if I could do that and how would I do that. So I did eventually go to law school after I finished my bachelor's degree, but I had a degree in journalism. So I had started working for a couple of newspapers, and I realized that I liked journal. I've always been a writer, but I realized that I wanted to do advocacy kind of writing, not that kind of, that balance, the way journalism is supposed to be objective and make sure you show both sides. So law school sort of fit it. And I had started a rape crisis center earlier in that, before I went to law school, and mostly because as I started working as a reporter, I started meeting people who were in the women's movement. The local Now chapter, was an identification that we needed a rape crisis center in the suburban community I was living in. So I sort of got pulled into it. I think it became part of the larger women's rights for me, but then I got more and more specific. And in law school, I took some classes around labor law. I really got interested in employment discrimination. And at that time, sexual harassment was not considered to be illegal in this country, not under the regular sex discrimination, federal and state laws. So when I got out of law school, I started working on, started getting jobs that would allow me to do that kind of law. Once again, it was not a popular kind of field. There weren't a lot of jobs, but I did work for a legal aid program for a while. In Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I was taking women to court who were filing for divorce, who had a history of domestic violence. We had just passed this restraining order law in Michigan, so the judges weren't even aware that they could tell these guys to stop doing it, and maybe there'd be some action to penalize them if they did. And that really gave me the introduction into not only sexual assault, which I had done previously, but advocacy, but then domestic violence. And one of the things that was so, I guess, fascinating and intriguing and just horrifying for me when my niece was killed about 20 years, well, this is 20 years later, although I knew these women came from all different socioeconomic backgrounds and races and age, somehow I thought my family was separate, was the other. Back then there weren't on the radio and TV and the social media every 5 minutes people who were getting shot and killed. But Columbine had happened that spring. Maggie was killed the October after Columbine. So there was a beginning to understanding. There were some people that were not necessarily well regulated, I guess is the word, and that would fall into the domestic violence. And I wasn't working with dating violence at that time. Mm-hmm. So when my niece was murdered, I had been working as an attorney, also litigating sex discrimination cases, started doing some sexual harassment work, and I also worked for state government. So I was doing some public policy work. So what was, I guess, intriguing and amazing to me, and maybe somewhat revelatory, was the moment Maggie was killed, where I found out about what happened to her. It was kind of this horrendous moment, but it was also like, oh, that's why I've been doing all this work for all these years, and not really understanding, because it had never personally touched me before. I didn't have those experiences myself personally. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of okay, so I'm prepared for this, but I wasn't quite prepared for the emotional level of it. Suddenly, as survivor of homicides are learning, and we see them every day now, that this is a loved one who's been killed. You cannot change that. The man who killed my niece killed himself, which in some way was a difference from other cases where you have to go through the court system, and that's even harder to deal with, I think, personally. But and suddenly I had to deal with all that, and I had to figure out, I didn't want to get stuck in my anger. I didn't want to believe that there was nothing I could do about this. And so, as you said in the introduction, I realized that in Maggie's moment of death, because he had never physically assaulted her before he killed her, that she didn't realize that she was going in so much danger. And so I couldn't change that moment, but I could help women who were in that moment and did survive to move on, as Maggie couldn't. So, as I said, I'm an attorney. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a person that does workshops. I decided I was going to do something, and I started sort of thinking about it as a workshop. I had done some creativity workshops as a writer before that, and I really put this together in a way that now, 20 years later, I really can feel, although I still miss Maggie and I still have a sense that I wanted to do something different, perhaps, that was more in line with my background, attorney. But every woman in the shelter after Maggie was killed was Maggie, and I emotionally couldn't do it. So I could do this. And I sort of, for 20 years now, have figured out how to do it and how to make it be something that the women that I have met, the survivors I've met, hundreds of them now, could help them to move on and to find, and I call it thriving rather than just surviving.
I'd like to go back and talk about, because Maggie had no idea she was in danger. Her ex-boyfriend had never assaulted her, or never had been physical, or never showed any signs of violence prior to just killing her. I mean, what was their relationship like, that she broke up with him and she figured she was just going to be moving on? She had absolutely no clue of what he was capable of, I think is what I'm saying. Right.
And, she was 19, he was 20. So it wasn't their first, wasn't Maggie's first relationship. But I think in that situation, because there was no physical violence, and I've worked with a lot of women who've told me this, that there was no physical violence until they leave. So what the domestic violence movement has identified is what we call warning signs, or some people call them red flags. And one of them, or several of them, are around a particular time, a moment in that relationship where they're most vulnerable. And one of them is when you leave. So what people don't think about is that although Maggie did describe to to her friends and her family members that he was being emotionally abusive to her. He was saying things, he was being, I guess the way most kids is, he was being mean to her. And that he wouldn't accept the end of the relationship. She ended the relationship, which is a warning sign, a person who's not willing to accept the end of a relationship. He also had done a number of things, which today we have some better words for those behaviors. And he was very manipulative. He actually manipulated her that night to come to his room, which was something that she had done before. She had gone there to help him with some school papers. So it wasn't unusual that she would do that. But in that moment, she really didn't want to do it, but he manipulated her. Today we have words. In fact, they've now moved into the legal language of domestic violence crimes and domestic violence in the family law courts, which is called coercive control. So a person who has a need for power and control, when they lose that power, when they lose that control, for example, the end of the relationship, which they don't accept, that person, we may not know what that person can do next. And that's what Maggie missed about this most of all. But on the other hand, because he never physically assaulted her, she had no bruises and marks to go to the campus police or even outside the campus to say that I'm in danger. It was a very small campus. His dorm room, he lives right across the parking lot from me. I see him in class every day, and, is there something we can do about that? So none of that was available to her. And I think because my niece was very bright and was one of those problem solver kids, that she was going to go to his room one more time that night to tell him to leave her alone, and that she was going to end it there. It was going to end. What she didn't know is he had a gun, that he had bought the gun 10 days before that. And once again, a small community in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And the gun store owner, he used a college dormitory address to buy the gun. And the gun store owner knew that. He knew the college, it was a small town. He had no legal obligation to call the school. And obviously he felt no moral obligation to do that. Because school had a no gun policy that was just put in place. And the school officials told us afterwards that if the gun store owner would have told him that, would have called and notified them, they would have had reasonable cause to search his room and to take the gun. So all these kind of confluence of things, or things that didn't happen that night or days before. But I think the key part is that Maggie did miss some of the warning signs, although he was very, very good. And the men I have worked with over the years, and I have done offender groups. One of the things I did after Maggie was killed is I actually started working with male offenders, domestic violence offenders, doing psychoeducational programs with them after they were arrested for a crime around domestic violence. And so that manipulation, that power and control, that part of masculinity that we don't like to admit is there, even the men don't like to admit that really propelled this into a very dangerous situation. And it became clear that he had an intention to kill her and kill himself. And so that's really the platform on which not only we as a family had to address this, but also the college.
I want to go back to talking about, that dangerous time when, the woman ends the relationship. What safety measures can a woman do, even if she doesn't think that, he's not going to do anything, she doesn't even, what precautionary measures can somebody take?
So for many years now in the domestic violence movement, there's been obviously a lot of work to try to address that time period. Some of the things that were not in place in Maggie's 22 years ago now, but some things that have been in place for a number of years. One of them is called a safety plan. So what that means, for example, when one breaks up with one's partner, you should not be in a space with them where you, I would say a non-public space. So Maggie could have met with him in a public space, although he could have then brought the gun in, killed other people. So it's a little bit shaky, but it's not an easy process. But for many women, when you call the hotline, and there's a national domestic violence hotline, you can go on to the internet and just type that in and the number will pop up. And they will talk about safety planning. For some women, that means, particularly if you're still in a relationship, and Maggie was not cohabitating with him, but to have a plan, how to get out, where to go, have a bag packed, have your kids be ready to get your kids ready to move through it. So that's one thing that Maggie didn't have. Like I said, she was a problem solver, but she really had no clue this man was going to go there. And that is what I tell a lot of women who tell me, well, it's only just verbal abuse. He's only just insulting me and trying to control me a bit, and I can manage that. Well, but you don't know where that place is going to go, particularly for someone who's controlling. When they lose control, as in you decide you don't want to be with them anymore, you have never seen that part of them. And it may trigger something that is, who knows, it's in their background, in their own experiences of loss, or people leaving them or abandoning them as a child, who knows, but you don't know that piece. The second thing that a lot of people have been doing now, with this kind of movement forward, is to begin to educate the people around them. For example, the police have been more highly educated and trained around domestic violence. So it used to be, they'd show up to a call, women calls, my husband's beating me, or he's being, he's trashing the house or whatever. And they'd come in, try to calm everybody down, and say, you go over here and you go over here and we'll talk to you separately. And then, just take a walk around the block and it'll be okay. That hasn't happened for many years, but for many years that happened. And so police have been trained more. In fact, what I understand is that those warning sign lists that I go through, the not accepting the end of the relationship, violence, particularly if there's guns in the house or access to guns, the police will actually, at a call, they will go through that list with the victim and say, are any of these things present? And if they are, particularly previous abusive conduct towards her, particularly physically abusive, or he has a record of being physically violent in other situations, or there are guns in the house, they will do a quick danger assessment and they will make a determination as to what should happen here, particularly arrest him, get her out of the house into the shelter. So it's more of a community kind of protection safety plan than just, but of course that means that the police have to show up, and these are always dangerous calls for the police. There's a great danger to them. They don't know what's going on in the situation, and many police officers have actually been killed by the perpetrator of the domestic violence in that situation. So trying to get to that space where people can see, and not to be overly cautious and overly crazy about it and making yourself really anxious about it. But I think many women I've worked with over the years know there's something wrong in the relationship. And it may not be the easiest thing to get out, but I can remember a time, and probably you can too, when there were no domestic violence shelters, when there were no hotlines, when there were no rape crisis services. So those pieces are in place there, and they are free of charge. There's not a charge for it. So that's certainly, there's a possibility, not in every case, certainly didn't happen in my niece's case, that these community resources, these people who are highly trained and the hotline staff can really help you walk through it. But it is very, very dangerous. And there's lots of implications for you staying and leaving, and also for your children. So you put yourself into the criminal justice system, perhaps you put yourself into the family court system, and the child welfare system may also step in. So sometimes women stay for that reason. Most women actually stay because they don't have the money to get out. Which is another whole thing we've been trying to work on, but or at least identifying that, not that she's stupid and wants to stay being abused, but that it's really, these are controlling people. It's really hard to
Right.
get out from under their grip.
Well, and controlling people can be incredibly manipulative.
Oh yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, they're masterful at it.
Oh, I mean, he knew exactly how to manipulate Maggie to come to his room that night. Absolutely.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I mean, first of all, it's wonderful to know that there are communities. It's a community effort to help women get out of situations like that and to help protect them. Because like you said, when we were growing up, there was no such thing. And if somebody had been abused or was currently being abused, it was just hush up. It was
Yep.
just kind of swept under the rug, and people might talk about it, but it was not something
Right.
that,
And we didn't have words for it. The word
No.
domestic violence was like, mostly it was like, oh, her husband drinks too much and he's been a little rough with her. But yeah, there was no, if you don't have words for it, then we don't even know how to describe it to somebody in a way that's not going to be like, I'm crazy, and you're not going to help me, right?
Exactly. And yeah, there is such thing as being called hysterical when you're a woman, especially back in those days that hysteria was used a lot.
Right.
So I want to ask you about restraining orders, the efficacy of them, how they work. Do they always work?
Well, when I used to practice law, when I was representing women, my spiel would always be, it's a piece of paper. And back in the day, that I was practicing back in the 1980s or so, early 90s, that piece of paper didn't have a lot of weight to it. It has a little more weight to it these days, but it's still a piece of paper. And I would always tell my clients, your partner may agree to abide by this piece of paper, and he may not. And if he doesn't, there are some things that could happen that would allow him to do that, but there's no fail-safe situation. Over the years, they've gotten better. One of the things that when I was practicing law was difficult is the police didn't always have a record of these, so that she was sort of waving this paper and they're like, well, what is this paper? Who signed it? So there, in many communities, there's now a process by which the court files a copy or a record of the restraining order with the police, and so the police can actually call it up on their radio gizmos, whatever, and see, yes, there is an order, was signed by the judge, and here's the requirements of it. So that's one thing that's been a little bit better. So if the woman does call the police, it might happen. And then the other thing that's been a little bit better, and I should say much better, is that there's a little more teeth to these kind of orders. Particularly if there's been an arrest. Here in Connecticut, there's an order that the judge will sign, and if the person who against whom the order is issued violates the order, and it may just be actually just seeing her or calling her, or it might be not only doing that, but also harming her in some way or harming the children, that order is going to be enforced by 6 months in jail. You're going to jail for 6 months. And when you come out, you're not going to have a felony on your record, and it's going to be a violent felony. So that means it's going to restrict your ability to get certain jobs, and a lot of jobs. And certainly in a customer service job these days, people don't want people who've got those kind of records. So there's a little more teeth to them, and there's a little bit more enforcement of them. At least the woman is not herself trying to enforce them, but they are not the remedy. They're not the solution to the problem. They are helpful. I think it convinces some people in the system that this woman is serious. This is a serious problem, and she's not just, as you mentioned before, hysterical. And particularly if there's children involved, usually the court can also order who has custody of those children, or at least indicate who has custody. And that happens a lot in these cases where there's also a kidnapping of the children, or he holds them over on his visitation night and won't return them, which is just another power and control thing. Not really about the kids, it's really more about power and control. So we don't have it perfect. It's a little bit better. But I always tell victims and survivors, this is just a piece of paper. So you have to also be clear about what you need to do to keep yourself safe, if possible, and also your children. And then to feel that if you call the police, that there's hopefully something that could happen there. And most jurisdictions are better at this, but there's still a lot of training. There's still a lot of perceptions about this. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a very dangerous call for the police. So I wouldn't say that they won't come out. I would say that they won't do their best job, but it's dangerous. So it's not, they're not looking for these kind of calls on a regular basis in their own on their shift.
Wow. Oh, it breaks my heart. It just really does. But yeah, I mean, I feel for everybody involved, including the police who have to answer the calls, because they have no idea what they're walking into.
Yep. And if there's guns there, if there's guns that would be used, if there's people, if a situation will be that because they have to make a determination who did what to whom. If there's going to be an order issued, it should be to the right person. And if there's going to be, the custody moving around because of this incident, they have to be clear about who should be held accountable for it in terms of not so much the custody, but, the dangers of children.
I recently interviewed a gentleman for my podcast, and he was the one who was being abused.
Yep.
And he was a very big man, and once it got to the point where he couldn't take it anymore, and he did call the police, and they laughed in his face when they walked in and they saw his petite little wife, and there he was, this big hulking man, and they just laughed and left.
Yep. Yeah, it's still an issue. Actually, it's also an issue in gay and lesbian relationships because usually the police try to sort it out by sex. The man did it, the woman was the victim. But if there's two men or two women, it's always a challenge. And sometimes they arrest both people, which is not the best solution. But in the moment, that may be the only thing they can figure out. Or it may be that there's this, big hulking guy or a petite man or a small man and a wife who's got a baseball bat in her hand and she's saying she was the victim. Well, that might be true because, and not knowing the history of that relationship, he may have done some things to her. So she knows. The women would always describe this to me, particularly when I was doing offender groups, that the man, that they get the look from the man. And that look means that he's ready to go physical. And so in that moment, she might have taken a baseball bat in her hand to protect herself, knowing what had happened in the past. The police officer has no idea of any of that interaction previously. So, she may get arrested because she's holding the bat and he's not. And I've also had women clients who the judge would say the same thing to about, when I was trying to get a restraining order and she's this kind of bigger, heavier woman, and he's kind of, scrawny and smaller than she is. And he's like, well, how could she be afraid of him if she's bigger than him? And it's not physicality. It is that it's power and control, and anybody can do that, and certainly do it at a long enough pattern that there is intimidation there, even though it doesn't look like from the outside. And that kind of intimidation, even that look, means, if you don't do what I want you to do, this consequence is going to happen. And it happened before, and it's going to happen right now if you don't do what I want you to do, or however this scenario is playing out.
Nobody knows what goes on behind closed doors.
No, and you can't judge anybody's relationship. Many of these men, and I've worked with some women. I worked mostly in legal aid when I was litigating divorces with domestic violence victims, but I've worked with women across the whole economic spectrum, and money is not an indicator this won't happen. And money doesn't mean, if you come from money, that you have access to money to get out. There's lots of reasons why women stay. There's lots of reasons why men do this, and we haven't even been able to pull apart why men do this. And I think we're just learning more that not just about for example, many of the men that I worked with rare exception, and I did offender groups with men. I did maybe 3 or 4 groups a week for about 15 years. Most of the men, when I've asked them the question, what your childhood was like, would tell me that they either witnessed domestic violence as a child or that they were abused themselves as children. So they have a trauma history, which triggers a whole lots of things. and they usually have an inability to really cope in the world, or because of their history or their criminal record based on either domestic violence or street violence or gang violence or whatever, they don't have education and jobs, so they're in their own spiral of feeling of being angry and triggering violence. And it's been fascinating to me, unfortunately, when you look at the gun violence that goes on, the mass shooting, many of these men have histories of domestic violence or sexual assault backgrounds, either criminal backgrounds, or they have been, it was noted by the police in investigating the shooter that his social media was full of rants against women and to sexually assault them or murder them. So this kind of misogyny, the hatred of women, the anger about women, just permeates the society for this kind of element. And I don't know how to. I mean, we're talking about this as a society, and they talk about it very broadly as mental health issues, but it's really much more specific than that. In many of these cases, it's very specific about domestic violence, sexual assault. They have shown themselves before the mass shooting as one of those people, or white supremacy, or some kind of an issue that that takes anger and violence and victimization and just puts it out there in a way that they're going to control the situation by doing something that's outside of the social norm, like being physically violent or intimidating, or God forbid, having guns or knives or whatever to really hurt not only the woman in the situation or the other relationship partner, but also the children who, like I said, these young men all said this is what they grew up with.
Wow. It just seems like it's another pandemic that we have going on right now. And it's like, well, why isn't anybody addressing this? Because, like you said, it is mental health to a certain degree, but it's the whole package.
Right.
And I know when something terrible happens, everybody says, oh my goodness, it came out of nowhere. Nobody ever saw this coming. But when they look back in the person's history, it's like those red flags were everywhere and big signs that said something is going to happen.
Right. And those red flags are the ones that right now you can buy a gun in this country, particularly an AR-15, and still not have those red flags be to hold you back. And now it's because your age, like in most states or some states, you can buy a gun, an AR-15 or other guns when you're 18, just 18. What do they say? Your brain doesn't fully develop until you're 25. So we're allowing young people who may be completely, capable of handling this weapon. I don't know, but we're assuming that they have some brain capacity before they're 25 that could allow them to do that. In most cases, they don't. But you're right. You look. You're right. If you look at the records, and of course, many times this is after the fact. Military records will show you this. Criminal records will show you this. School records will show you this. And any kind of but most people, don't really enter the mental health system, particularly, unless they, we think of it being inpatient in a psychiatric hospital. So, I've never done the research on this. What would be exactly how the mental health treatment would show up? The young man who killed at the bank recently, killed, I guess, his former employers. He actually was seeing a psychiatrist. His parents had gotten to see a psychiatrist. He also had been doing some other kind of group therapy or some kind of other mental health treatment. And he was on some medication, some serious depression. And none of that showed up when he went to buy a gun.
Wow.
So that's what I don't understand about this mental health thing. That if we just go to, and then of course, in many of the states, and I worked in state government, working on budgets in many states, the mental health services have actually been cut over the years since we deinstitutionalized and got people out of those horrible institutions into some real good
Right.
community care, but many states don't support the community care because it's expensive. No, we don't need to do that. It's like, these people will figure it out. Well, then they show up next on somebody's radar, either a mass shooting or a domestic violence or a sexual assault or something in school.
There you go.
And that's really what we haven't addressed as a society yet.
Well, it seems like the people who do seek out mental health are the ones who probably don't need it as much.
Right.
They're probably a little bit more in tune with their emotions and their situation. And it's like, I need to get a little bit of help here so it doesn't get out of control.
Or somebody has stepped in to say you need help, and either it's your parents or your friends or some kind of intervention, they call it. Yeah.
Jeez. Okay, so tell us about the workshops. I love the name, I love the title, My Avenging Angel Workshops. When did you decide to do that, and how did that come about?
So after Maggie was killed, I spent about a year in and out of Michigan helping. I live in Connecticut, helping my family sort of deal with this. And then I came back sort of full time here to Connecticut, and I was trying to well, what am I supposed to do here? I had this idea about doing a workshop about working with women because I couldn't do the crisis intervention anymore. So I put it together. I had local hospital who decided to support me and sort of got it. I started doing it, and what I was basically doing was sort of replicating some of my own process. So after Maggie was killed, I didn't want to get stuck in my anger. I wanted to figure out how to motivate myself to move forward and to do something good with this. So I had in my mind, and I don't even know exactly how I did this. Some people talk about when you sort of channel something and you're not quite sure. How did you get, you're a writer, sometimes where did that character come from? I don't know. I kind of dreamed her up, maybe. I don't know. So I got these, put together what I still call today, the 7 steps to thriving after abuse. And they really were sort of a combination of steps to get people moving again in terms of goals, but also addressing some of the ways that they might be held back. And not that, just because they've been abused doesn't mean that they can or can't do this. We all sort of do this, but the motivation to positive energy to do something, focused desire. I really want to go do this workshop, and then really recognizing the kind of thoughts you have in your head that say, well, you can't do that. I mean, you're a lawyer. You can't, why would you do this? What I call limiting beliefs about yourself. And then understanding that if you do push through that wall of fear and resistance, that it's going to feel really good for you. And it's going to motivate you to do the next thing. So one of the exercises that I've put together to help sort of overcome fear, or to identify what that fear is to sort of get I call it the real you, the part of you that's been untouched. For many of the women I work with, it's not just they usually have a presenting problem, as I describe it, which doesn't mean to mitigate it, but kind of interesting. So they come to me as previously the last thing that's happened to them is domestic violence. But if you ask them 2 questions or 3, you get back to, there was also child abuse in my life. I've had some traumatic experiences. I've had a really hard time getting through school, or I never got a good job. So it's a combination of all that. And they feel like everything every part of them has been touched by this stuff, and, body, mind, and spirit, and it's all been destroyed. And so I sort of challenge them to say, it's a part of you that's been untouched by all that's ever happened to you. And we're going to bring that part out and to motivate you. So for me, I realized that one of the things, this has been true about me in my whole life, is that if you give me meaningful work, if I do something that's meaningful, which is why when I went to law school, I didn't specialize in tax law. I think that there's a lot of lovely tax attorneys out there, but that to me was not meaningful work. So my meaningful work was the work I was doing up until Maggie's death. So let's figure out what your real you is. And so if you tell me that if I do this workshop, even though I have a lot of fear, I'll push through that fear so fast. Because I want to get, it's almost like, my parents, when I was a kid, if I had a good report card, I got to go to the ice cream store and get a hot fudge sundae. So that was, I'm going to get a good report card, because that's my reward. So really trying to break that apart and then begin to see where they're stuck. So, and for many of the women, they don't even know they're on a journey. So the first step I work on is seeing the journey. They have been a victim most of their lives. They tell me they're great survivors, and they've been spending all their energy, and whenever the next thing happens, then I'm going to survive it, and we'll just keep, not using the energy to push out farther. And I actually gave them a word for it. I called it thriver. Back when I first started doing this work, it was not a word that most people were using. Today, it's a little bit more out there. Actually, cancer survivors use it a lot more than domestic violence survivors. So they're like, oh, I want to be a thriver. Well, how do I do that? So really just trying to tease them through, so quiet the negative voice in your head, bringing up I call it the happy person inside, the real you, connecting to that positive energy, visioning a new life. Many of them don't see that people like them can vision, like I only see what's right in front of me, and the next thing that's going to happen is going to be bad too. And then really trying to, overcome the fears about moving that vision forward, and then setting new goals. So the women come out of the 2-day workshop with a new goal for themselves, that's very focused and lots of positive energy about it. Or maybe a goal they came into the workshop with, like, I really need to get a better job because I'm now a single mom, but they had so much negative energy and disbelief they could actually do that we sort of began to work on that. And I also was pretty clear when I started the workshops, for some reason, I guess, that I didn't want to just do the workshop, that I wanted to stay in touch with these women, and not so much for me to stay in touch, but them to stay in touch with each other, and to begin to role model for each other. Oh, look what Sophia did. Sophia can do that. I can do this. And I tell the women, if you've come through particularly a physically violent domestic violence situation, or a crisis of a sexual assault, and you make it through, you can do about anything. I mean, that's probably the hardest thing you've ever done. And if it's not, then let's bring up the hardest, and then that is your moment to realize, how did I do that? Was it positive energy? Was there someone who encouraged me? Did I have a focused desire? And so really trying to say to them, where are you stuck here? And if we can role model for each other. And for many of the women, I'm their role model when they come into the workshop, because they can't imagine that somebody they loved was killed by, and look at the good stuff Susan has done. So even that just gives them, they may not be sure how they're going to do all that, but they can see that somebody else has done it, and they really admire that. So I sort of like patch this all together. I've been doing it for about 20 years now, and I've had hundreds of women come through. During COVID time, I was always doing them in person here in Connecticut, which was great, having it in person, but we learned in COVID we couldn't do that for a while. So I've actually started doing them virtually, and they've done really well. So I now have women from other parts of the country, also women from other parts of the world who've come on. And many of them have told me that this is a piece that's missing in our crisis intervention, moving on kind of process. So, I applaud and have been part of the 40 years that I've worked to even develop that crisis intervention piece, and the hotlines and the police training, whatever. But many of the women who've come through that process tell me that, okay, so what's next? I got through the crisis of a sexual assault, so what's I want to move on, and that's where it drops off. So that's what I'm really working on now, is trying to design something that a program that could be integrated into the programs. I do these for free. I've been very clear about that the workshops are free of charge. I have a small nonprofit that supports me so I can do that. These are not women who have money, particularly at the time they leave. Financial abuse is prevalent in, they say, 94 to 99% of domestic violence situations. So they're walking, even women I know who have money someplace, it's some family money, they don't have access to money when they come out. So I've been very, very clear about that. So all the programs that I provide are free of charge. And then also trying to integrate it so that we could see that the whole system sort of supports the women who come through my workshop. If they come to both sessions, they are brought into, I call it the continuing community, the follow-up community. They like to call themselves archangels, not religious thing, but kind of like they graduated from angels to archangels. And the women who I've stayed in contact with, which has been quite a number of them, they have not gone back. So actually, what I do is a prevention program, not preventing them from getting into the relationships to begin with, or for the sexual assault that went on, but how to not get them to go back. And I think for a lot of people, the women themselves, and a lot of people who work in this movement, and the money that we put out for crisis intervention, which is a lot, it's very expensive to run a domestic violence shelter and a crisis intervention and a hotline, that money would be better spent, or to do a return on investment. If we invest on moving these women on as best we can, then they're not going to return, and not just for the money reason, but for them, their own personal life. And for many of the women that I've worked with over the years, I've also had a chance to see their children grow. And the children are not, they're not the ones that I talked about before. I had this history in my family of witnessing domestic violence and child abuse. These are not the kids that are growing into, and hopefully they will not be coming back into the system, or not be part of the system now that they're grown. So that's the work, I think that's the healing work that I think really needs to happen. And there are, in the psychological world, in the social work world, there's been a book a number of years ago, was put out by Dr. Judith Herman, called Trauma and Recovery. And she identified 3 stages of recovery from trauma. And that is the safety and stability. That's the shelters on the crisis hotlines to get them out stable. The remembering and mourning, looking at your life and seeing the pieces that have impacted you and how they impacted you. And then there's this reconnection and reintegration. I believe that they've always been, it's always there. The part of it that's been untouched has always been there, but they haven't been in touch with it. So to reintroduce them to that, and to integrate them into a larger community of healing, rather than the community of what's the next relationship I'm going to get in, and how is it going to impact me and my children. They don't want to do that anymore. They're thrivers. They want to move on. So I don't know how else to explain it.
No, that was great. And I just have to, give you accolades. Thank you so much for what you're doing. And I can't believe that you can impact that much change in 2 days. I think that's just incredible. And that the women don't have to pay for it. I mean, thank you for doing that. That's really incredible work. Right.
Well, sometimes I can actually see them transform in front of my eyes. I can actually see their faces kind of light up. And it's like, okay, positive energy. Okay, let's work on. So, and that alone, I mean, I'm a Cinderella girl. I love transformations. If I get to see that, that's like, I'm all in, that's really cool.
Well, in martial arts language, we would call it their spirit is returning.
Ah, yes. In the shamanic tradition, it's a soul retrieval, bringing back the parts of the soul that have decided, we're not going to stay here for right now. Why don't you go do this and figure it out, and then we'll come back. Yeah. Yeah, and for many women, that's actually been used a lot in some of the healing arts. So yeah, we really haven't explored some of this healing art stuff for women, for people, but particularly women who've come through trauma. I think we're even just identifying what the trauma impacts are. There's been some research done recently about brain injury with domestic violence clients, women who've gone through brain injury, and we always think of brain injury as like, in a car accident or, TBI kind of things. This is like the bashing the head against the wall. Even strangulation can cause certain level of brain injury. And just to give women, information, hopefully not freak them out, but, there have been impacts on you physically that have been because of the violence, not because you're a bad person and you can't figure it out. And to give them more information, and not only information to the women, but also the staff that works, or the police that works with them. Well, she can't even get her act together to get her paperwork to court. So there's something wrong with her. No, that's called traumatic brain injury. That's an impact. So more of that information coming into the system is really, really helpful, not only to the the women, but also to the people who are trying to help.
Well, I think even without a traumatic brain injury, just that much emotional and psychological trauma, the way it impacts the nervous system and puts the woman in fight or flight for so long can cause some trauma to the brain.
Right. They're sort of locked into that. I don't know the technical medical terms, but they're locked into that little space where everything is always the next crisis rather than, I can plan ahead and I can figure this out. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a sympathetic nervous system and it never turns off because they never know when the next shoe is going to fall. Let's just put it that way.
Right. Right. And that could happen years and years and years later. It may not be that they can even accomplish that. A good therapist can help them to identify some of that, but it's not always like an overnight thing. Or they may have many women I've worked with, particularly more in the past, in the beginning, were in their 50s and 60s, and this has been going on for years.
Oh. And then those pathways are just so ingrained that it takes a little bit longer to interrupt the signals and get back to homeostasis, basically.
Right, right.
So I love books. I mean, I talk about creating something beautiful out of a horrible tragedy. And I just think that Maggie's looking down at you and she's like, you go, girl, you go, Aunt Susan.
Yeah, she was into butterflies. So I don't have any butterflies in my background here, but butterflies always show up someplace. When we've had retreats and stuff. We've been like, oh, there's monarch butterflies everywhere. Oh, I think Maggie's here. So yeah, there's little signs that I get that. I mean, I know that if she had survived this herself, she'd be doing this work with me in a minute. I know she would, because she was also interested. I mean, she had the same crazy idea that we could do good in this world, and so and no matter what happens to us. And she'd always say she'd ask me about, she was pretty young when she asked me about the cases I was doing and the women I was working with, and I would tell her a bit about their story. She's like, well, Aunt Susan, that's so unfair. We have to do something about that.
Well, basically, that's where you get some of your ideas, I think sometimes.
I think
she could be planting them.
Yeah.
So tell us about your books. Tell us about the workshop series or the Thriver series, the Thrive Zone book series.
Right.
Did you do those before you went into the novels?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to think that I was writing some novels before Maggie was killed. And so that sort of carried over into after. And then the workbooks that I put together, the entering the Thriver Zone, staying in the Thriver Zone, and living in the Thriver Zone, were really after I'd done the workshops for about 10 years. And I realized, because I've always been a writer and I've written legal books and other nonfiction books and in journalism, that, I was talking about that, focus, desire, and you get to the end and the reward is you feel really good. And then you come back around and say, okay, what's the next thing I could do? And then I'm like, oh, if I'd done the workshops and it's been pretty good, and it really feels meaningful, maybe I could write a book about them. So I decided to put the material that I developed from the workshops into the workbooks. So they were designed for survivors to go through. They don't have lines in them to write in, because libraries don't like lines in books, but they basically can do it with a journal alongside, which is what the women do in the workshop is. And then they go through this. The first book is about the 7 steps, all the exercises that I use. And the women have agreed to give me some sample writings that they did in the workshop so they can see what that's. And then I also recorded some women who talked about their own journey from victim to survivor to thriver. So there's actual, I call them thriver success stories in that book. And then Staying in the Thriver Zone is the second book. And that book is basically the motivational model that I talked about, the positive energy, focused desire, pushing through your fears, and then finding the real you. And that also has some sample writings and some other exercises that I've used that provoke women to see that they've really been able to manifest their desires and how not so easy it was, but that if you follow that pattern, you can actually do it. And then the third book, Living in the Thriver Zone, I really wanted to, I always say that I can tell you what I do, and I've told you a lot about what I do, but the women can just demonstrate it so much easier than I can, just by their own stories and their own energy about it. So I interviewed 7 women who've come through my workshop, Some of them were actually in my very first workshops, and it stayed with me for 10, 15 years. And I asked them, questions like, what was it like for you? Where were you and how'd you feel about your future when you came into the workshop? And then what pieces of the workshop helped you the most? Which of the 7 steps? And then where are you today? And how do you define yourself? We use the sort of measure is, if you're a thriver, how do you feel, what's thriving feel like for you? And then what's living well feel like for you? In fact, the subtitle of that book is Living in the Thriver Zone, a celebration of living well is the best revenge. And they like that idea. They like that living well thing.
Oh yeah.
Because it's true, a person that's been oppressive to you, or they're not going to change. Like they're unlikely to. The revenge is not going to be even possible or satisfying. But the one thing that they don't want you to do, because they're controlling people, is to live well. That will make them. It's like, yeah, he's going to be really pissed off if I get my business going, because he told me I could never do that and I was too stupid. But look at this, I can do that. So that's really been great. So they've also been helpful for people who work with domestic violence and sexual assault victims, or actually they in general, because I don't, it's not like something that only happens to women in that situation. Else could happen to men. It could happen to people in other kinds of trauma. And then the novel I was writing, I always wanted to, as a little girl, I always wanted to write a novel. I, love reading. I've read novels for years and I love storytelling, but I really didn't think I could do that. Once again, it was my negative voice in my head. I could do nonfiction writing, but I can't do fiction writing. There's something different there. So I wanted to write something about Maggie, and I didn't want it to be a memoir. That seemed emotionally too difficult. There's too much stuff there. And I wanted to have a little bit of emotional distance from the story. So I changed the young woman's name who was killed, and I changed her background and everything. But I really wanted to explore what that not many people understand about being a survivor of homicide. I didn't understand until it happened to me and my family and my friends and Maggie's friends. And so I wanted to show that how did her family and friends, particularly her friends, the college where she was killed, the college where Maggie was killed, didn't do the best job sort of addressing all this. So in fiction, I got to say what they should be doing, or what they could be doing, or at least exploring. In the first book, Awaken, the first book is set in 1999. It's a story of a young woman who's killed and gets caught between the two worlds, and then what happens to her and her friends. And then I wanted to go 10 years later, which is Emerge. So 10 years later, where are all these people? What are they doing? And and the college has been doing some really interesting things. Her best friend has started to teach there and is doing some women's studies stuff, and it's really been cool. And then the third book, called Thrive, is set 20 years later. And in fact, the woman, her best friend, is doing a workshop called My Avenging Angel Workshops. So I get to put that in there. So it was really just, for me, a cathartic experience. But I also think that many people, like the warning sign list, you can hand that out, and that's helpful to people. But sometimes people learn through story. So I tried to include, the scenario that this young woman in the novel, she's called Lacey, the woman who's killed. And so what are some of the things, not only that she missed, but her friends missed, and his friends also missed, about his motives and his state of mind. So it's been fun. It's been fun to write. And they're not only out in print and ebook, but my cousin has started to, she's got 2 of them in audiobook now.
Wow. And
I'm working on the 3rd one. So try to make them as accessible as possible to people. An audiobook is something that people have been, interested in much more lately. So I'm a writer. That's what I do. And I always end up writing, but I think that's one of the ways that people can get the information and then start to use it in ways that maybe I'd never thought of, or to expand it into. I think what we're expanding, maybe it's because of COVID, I don't know. I think the world is being much clearer about the healing that needs to go on. And so if I can contribute my little pieces into some healing techniques, that would be that'd be great.
Yeah, I totally agree. I really love the way that you were weaving through the power of storytelling, because that
Mhm.
really seems to resonate with people. And then the message seems to stick, because that was going to be one of the final questions I had for you, was to how do we educate, women in prevention?
Mhm. Yeah. And how to expand that idea of prevention,
Right.
not just not getting into it, but also how to stay out of it. One of the things that I've been exploring more recently, and I knew this from when I was working at Legal Aid, helping getting women out, is that finances are a huge, huge issue why
Oh,
women
yeah.
stay. Why they stay and why they go back.
Mhm.
I don't think we understand as a society, or even a small group of us understand the impact of the financial abuse impact. And it's not just in the immediate moment of leaving that relationship or staying for,
Mhm.
there's a study right now that says that when asked women, how long did you stay, how much longer did you stay in a domestic violence than you wanted to because of money? And the answer was longer than they wanted to. And half of them said they stayed up to 2 years longer because they didn't have the money to get out. And
Wow.
in most domestic violence situations, 10 minutes is like a death trap. 2 years. And that usually meant they'd have to, have a job, or, peel off some money off the grocery money that he gives her, because she only gets a certain amount to spend,
Mhm.
and then sending it somewhere where he's not going to have access to it. And maybe it's her sister, or, a friend, or the banks don't seem to get this stuff. So I really don't think that we have defined, maybe this is the way I can describe it. I think we're still working on what we could do
Mhm.
as a society to prevent this. Yes, it's good to get women to not even get in these relationships, but I think there are a lot of ways that we keep women there. And we
Mhm.
think it's their fault. We think it's
Mhm.
because of money, it's because of conditioning, it's because the system is really not going to help them, or they know that it's so scary out there that maybe the thing they know is better than what they might encounter. And there are stories out there, the
Mhm.
police aren't going to help you.
Mhm.
And in fact, the perpetrator will tell you that all the time. Oh, cops aren't going to do anything. You got to
Mhm.
stay.
Mhm.
So I think prevention needs to be much more of a community response, and not just, why did you stay?
Right. Wow. Well, Susan, thank you so much for being on the show. My goodness. I mean, again, I just can't help but think that
Oh,
I
thank
know
you.
Maggie is just so proud of you.
Thank you. Well, thank you
And
so
so,
much for what you do, and also for understanding that this is the kind of conversation that we need to have about this, because it really is. We're beyond just saying, "Oh, what a terrible problem," and "Gee, I'm so glad I'm not in that situation." But
yeah,
it's everywhere, and
yeah,
or else our children have been exposed to it, and
yeah.
that's the
Or
worst.
saying, just throwing up your hands and saying somebody has to do something.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So, how can listeners get a hold of you? Where can they find you? And tell us how they could sign up for your workshop, or if they know somebody that they could refer to sign up for
Mhm.
the workshop. I know that the more people we tell, the more they're going
Right,
to reach,
right.
and the more people you
Absolutely.
can help. And then where they can find the books, because the books sound absolutely fascinating.
Okay, so I have a website. We all have websites, so this is
Of
great.
course.
So a website is www.thriverzone.com, thriverzone.com. And if you put in Thriver, usually it'll pop up. I'll pop up somewhere. So that on that website, you can buy my books there.
Mhm.
In fact, I have a special, the two trilogy books, 3 sets of the workbooks and 3 sets of the novels are, I think, on sale there. And then I will sign them for you if you buy them through my workshop. They're also available on Amazon and
Mhm.
Barnes and Noble. They are on ebooks on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And as I said, the two of the novels are now on audiobook on iTunes and Audible. The workshops are available. I do them 4 times a year. I have workshops coming up this fall. I'll do them in the fall. I do 2 in the winter, spring. If you go on that website, there's a little tab that says workshops, and you can punch that. thriverzone.com, or else you can go directly to myavengingangel.com. And they're 2 days. They're all days. They're virtual on Zoom. And if you come to both sessions, then I'll invite you to the ongoing program. You can register. There's a phone number there, not my phone number, but a confidential health referral line there that you can register, or you can register online directly with me. So yeah, and I do get referrals from therapists. I get referrals. I'm not a therapist, but therapists love when I do visioning and goal setting with their clients. I get referrals from attorneys whose clients are moving through the system and really need some help. I get referrals from mental health people, teachers, and also from other women who've come through. So I'd love to invite anybody to come and do that. Or if you know somebody who, and even if I've had women who've come to the workshop 10, 15 years after they've left an abusive relationship, just trying to never quite getting their energy, to focus. So I do not work with women. I would say this pretty equivocally with women who are still in the abuse, just because there's too many things they're dealing with. And I don't have 24/7 kind of crisis intervention hotline abilities. I don't duplicate those services. They're really important services. I call them the life-saving services. What I do is life-changing. So if you really want to take that next step, or you can certainly invite, if you work in a domestic violence program or a sexual assault program, definitely contact me. You can contact me through the website, or my email address is susan@thriverzone.com.
Got it. Well, I know already, as you're going through the list, I have I call her a young friend because she's only 46. I mean, she's just a baby, but she's a therapist.
Yes, that's great.
And she has her own private practice. So it's like, as you were talking, even as you were telling the story throughout the entire episode, I was thinking, I have got to contact her and give her your contact information.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'd love to talk to her. Yeah, I'm looking to train the trainer. I'm looking to get my materials out to people. And one of the other things I want to say about the workshop that's really important beside the free part is I don't have the women tell me their abuse story. I make sure they're safe, and I make sure they have those resources, therapists, hotlines, support groups, whatever. But that's because if they tell that story, first of all, I'm going to trigger, and they're all going to trigger, and we're not going to get anywhere. There are places they can do that, and they need to do that. It's part of one of the stages of remembering and mourning. But we start from the place where they are, wherever they are, and we move forward. And so now their new story that they tell is their Thriver success story. And we want to hear that story because we want to be able to say, oh boy, if she could do that, if she can become a thriver, and I can do that too.
Excellent. Again, Susan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being on the show. You're a fabulous guest, and I absolutely love your positive energy. I love the work that you're doing. And I can't thank you enough for getting the word out and for helping so many women. It's awesome.
Thank you. And thank you for your podcasts and all the things that you've been putting out there, because I think maybe we'll, the revolution will not be televised, but we're getting it out there.
That's right. That's
it's
right.
happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Okay. So thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you so much for listening. As always, I really appreciate you tuning in, and please share this episode with everyone you know, because there's always somebody out there who needs to hear the message. And if we can help them, we can help change the world one person at a time. I firmly believe that. Do go to Susan's website. It is a beautiful website. I was stalking her on it earlier today so I could see all of her offerings. The books are beautiful. It's a wonderful tribute to a beautiful young lady.
Yes, and definitely on the website, you have to see a picture of Maggie. There's a short video on the homepage that talks about her and some of the women in my group. But yeah, she always likes it when people get to see her picture.
Well, and there's another great picture of Maggie, like as a little girl and going through her growing up years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so everybody do check out that website. And if you know of anybody that needs help, oh, please reach out to them and please do give them Susan's information, her contact info, all her links, everything is going to be in the show notes forever and ever. So reach out if you see somebody who's in a crisis situation or needs some help, give them Susan's number and give them some love. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.